I'm going to start, okay?
Yep.
Pessoal, bom dia quem está nos assistindo no YouTube. Então, a gente vai começar agora a nossa atividade com o professor Aurelien Mondon. Ele é professor da Universidade de Bath, na Inglaterra, do Departamento de Política, Linguagem e Estudos Internacionais. Ele também é cofundador da Reactionary Politics Research Network. Ele pesquisa a normalização da extrema-direita, discursos e políticas reacionárias, o hype populista e a construção do povo como uma ameaça à democracia. Está muito feliz de receber essa pessoa tão importante, que tem uma pesquisa tão interessante sobre esse assunto, e ele vai nos falar um pouco hoje sobre a normalização da extrema-direita e as eleições na União Europeia, há algumas semanas. E a sessão vai ser conduzida em inglês. Quem estiver no YouTube e quiser deixar perguntas em português, eu vou fazer a tradução. Então, o professor vai falar ali uns 45 minutos e depois a gente vai para uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. So, Aurelien, thank you very much for joining us here today, this morning. For us, it's the morning. In the UK, it is the afternoon. So, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully you find what I discuss interesting. So originally I was meant to talk a lot more about the EU elections, but a lot of things have happened since. So I'll be talking quite a bit about the French elections as well, and I will be talking as well about what has happened in the UK in the past few days, because I think it links to what we were planning on discussing originally. So hopefully that doesn't stray too far away from the original topic. So you should be able to see my my slides, and I will start with just discussing first the issue of mainstreaming and the issue of the mainstream. And to discuss this, I think we need to really question first and foremost what is normal, because of course we all feel that we know what is normal. We all feel that we know what is mainstream. If I ask you, for example, what is mainstream music, I'm sure you would be able to tell me bands that are mainstream for you, but the bands that are mainstream for you are probably not mainstream for me, and vice versa. The bands that are mainstream for you might not be the same as the bands that are mainstream for your parents, your grandparents, your children, and so on. So, you know, this is an easy way to understand the construction of what is normal, what is mainstream. And so what we try to do in our work with Aaron Winter and Katie Brown is to try to understand the process of mainstreaming better. And to understand the process of mainstreaming better, we need to take a critical approach to the processes of mainstreaming and the mainstream itself. So we start with a few key points. The first one is that the mainstreaming of far-right politics and reactionary politics is not new. This is something that has been going on for a very long time. In fact, we could trace it back to the 1960s and 70s, when some intellectuals in France in particular discussed issues of right-wing Gramsciism, borrowing from communist thinker Antonio Gramsci and the idea of hegemony, for example. So this is kind of the start of kind of intellectual movements on mainstreaming. It's been accelerated under the French Front National, but also under other parties such as the FPÖ in Austria and various other parties. So the idea that the mainstreaming of far-right politics is new, that there's a fourth wave of mainstreaming, is not quite accurate enough. We need to think about it in a more long-term manner if we really want to understand the roots of mainstreaming. The second point is that the mainstream's meaning and position is constructed, contingent, and fluid. We tend to assume far too often that there is such a thing as the mainstream that is in the middle somewhere or in the center of politics. But of course, the center of politics moves all the time. What is mainstream one day might not be mainstream the next day, or might have been mainstream before. So, you know, if you think, for example, about same-sex marriage, for a very long time, same-sex marriage was not mainstream at all. Nowadays, in many countries, it is. In some countries, it's not. If you think about abortion rights, again, it used to be not mainstream at all. Then in some countries, it became very, very mainstream. And then what we saw, for example, in the United States, is that this can be threatened again, and this kind of can move to the margins. So we have to be careful when we think about the mainstream, the center, as something that is solidified in a way. We need to also keep in mind that the mainstream is not always and essentially good. The mainstream varies a lot in its quality. It can be good and it can be bad as well. It can be good one day, it can be bad the next, and so on as public opinion changes, as mores change, and so on. So it's important to understand that the mainstream is not always essentially good. The center is not always essentially reasonable or good. We need to also wake up to the fact, and I think this is something that has changed in the past few years, but we really need to wake up to the fact that progress is not unidirectional or inevitable. For a very long time, we've been told that we just need to be patient and eventually everyone will be equal, everyone will have rights, everything will be fine. What we've realized in recent years is that clearly this is not the case. We should have known that before, of course, that this was not the case because all of this is contingent. But clearly nowadays we see that actually there is a lot of backlash and we are going backwards in various countries on various rights, in particular the rights of certain communities and minorities. So we need to keep this in mind. We also need to keep in mind the fact that far-right parties and far-right politics can move both ways. They can become more moderate or they can become more radical. It's not because we are going to be going further in time that they will all become more moderate, as we can see, for example, in the United Kingdom, where I am now, things have become worse and parties are becoming more radical. Sometimes they have become more moderate as well, but this is not inevitable. We need to keep in mind that party politics and discourse can move together, but they do not have to or not at the same time. Some parties can become more radical and politics can remain more moderate, or politics can move further to the right while parties stay the same. All of this doesn't have to happen at the same time. And finally, and I'll discuss that at length towards the end of this presentation, the relationship between the elite, public opinion, and the people is premised on uneven power relationships. The way mainstreaming works is not simply the people saying something that then feeds into discourse of politicians, of the media, of academics. In fact, the people at the top who have a particular privileged access to shaping public discourse, like journalists, politicians, and academics to an extent, and cultural figures and so on, do play a role in setting the agenda. So what we try to do in our work is first to figure out the process of mainstreaming and then to define the mainstream. And Katie Brown has done some amazing work on how to define the mainstream, and this is what she came up with. The mainstream is a contingent identity that is hegemonically positioned either through internal or external construction as representative of a norm or center, however defined in a particular context. So it seems quite complicated, but what Katie is telling us here is simply that there is no such thing as the mainstream that is not constructed by us. And so this is quite important to kind of remember. We construct the mainstream and the mainstream is contingent. What is mainstream one day doesn't have to be mainstream the next. Which leads us to the process of mainstreaming, which we've tried to define at length and conceptualize at length in a paper that was published in 2021 in the Journal of Political Ideologies, which again may seem complicated, but I think it is complicated. And so we cannot simplify the process of mainstreaming too much. What we try to say is that contrary to what has been assumed by many of our colleagues, it's not just an electoral process. It's not just a question of winning elections. It's not a question of having a strong party. We also need to pay attention to discourse. So I'm going to quote the article at length, and you can access it freely online if you're interested. The first point is that we argue it is essential to see discourse as key to the process of mainstreaming. It is not just about elections. It is not about just getting electoral power. It is also about discourse. And sometimes, imposing your discourse is more important than winning elections. What we argue is we need to avoid normative assumptions and conclusions. Understanding mainstreaming therefore requires a prerequisite acknowledgement that the mainstream is not only constructive, contingent, and fluid, but that it is not essentially good, rational, and moderate in and of itself, which is what I discussed before. But to emphasize this contingency and the role played by discourse in constructed hegemonic structures, we propose a framework of mainstreaming which challenges the linear narrative. And what we try to do is to underscore the value of engaging with the interconnectedness of different elements and acknowledging the power structures. To do is eliminate the role of mainstream elite actors in shaping public discourse with strategic effects for elections and a mediatory role with the electorate, but also entailing a cyclical process of normalization, which changes what is and is not acceptable in the mainstream. And so what does that look like? That looks like this, which looks very, very complicated. And I promise this is the end of my complicated points for this presentation. So what I'm going to move on to now is to talk about the EU elections. And so I think, hopefully you can still hear me. I think my connection might have dropped out for a little while, but hopefully you can still hear me. What I'm going to talk about now is the EU election. So I'm going to kind of put in practice, in a way, this kind of theorization, this kind of conceptualization of mainstreaming. And I want to first go back in time, and I want to go back in time to 2014 and to the 2014 EU elections, because they were really the first kind of far-right earthquake that we saw in EU elections. Or was it a hype? I would argue that it was a hype, and I will show you how you can read it in two different ways, and hopefully you can see my screen.
I think we lost your connection.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Sorry, I have no idea what happened.
No worries, it happens. So I think you'll have to upload your presentation again.
Yeah, can you allow me to share?
We should be able to share.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Am I ready to go on? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So sorry about the problem with the connection. Hopefully that's going to work. So what I was talking about was the need to go back to the 2014 EU elections, which were portrayed quite often as the first earthquake when it comes to the rise of far-right politics on the EU at the EU level. And what I want to argue is that we could just as well read it as a hype, in a way, as an exaggeration of the strength of the far right. And what I want to show you is how important it is to read these things carefully, because it has consequences. So this is one way to look at the 2014 EU elections. This is the way that has been read in the media mostly. What you can see in the darkest blue is the 2004 results, in medium blue 2009, and in lighter blue 2014. You can see a number of parties: the FPÖ in Austria, the FN, which is the French Front National before it was renamed, DF is the Danish People's Party, UKIP is the British far-right party, the PVV is the Dutch party of Geert Wilders, the DB is the Vlaams Belang in Belgium, J is Jobbik, and GD is Golden Dawn in Greece. So what you can see is that, yes, some parties were rising and some parties were rising significantly. In fact, 3 far-right parties in the 2014 elections won in their countries. These 3 parties were the Front National in France, the Danish People's Party, and UKIP in the UK. What you can see as well is that some far-right parties didn't do very well. The PVV and the Vlaams Belang, for example, did lose some votes. But what is more interesting to me is actually, the EU elections are what we call second-order elections. They are elections that people don't really understand, that people don't really care about, and therefore that have a very low turnout. And they're also elections that are prone to protest vote, because people don't feel that the vote, whoever they're voting for in the EU elections, has a particular impact on their day-to-day lives. They tend to be more open to voting for parties that are more radical, or parties that are closer to their politics rather than strategic voting. And of course, finally, the EU elections are particularly fertile for far-right parties that have very simple platforms which say, basically, the EU is bad. So as opposed to mainstream parties who are going to tell you, well, the EU needs to be reformed in this way or that way, far-right parties in 2014 were just telling you, we need to leave the EU, we need to destroy the EU, which was, of course, the case made by UKIP. And so we have a very simple message, and therefore it's not it's understandable that they might gather a big share of the vote. But what is even more important is if we look at the share of the vote when it comes to the number of registered voters. So when you include abstention and turnout, this is what happens. And what you can see, and you can see the same scale there, you can see that the results are a lot less impressive. And in fact, in 2014, both the Front National and UKIP got less than 10% of the registered votes. So when you take into account all of the people who can vote in France and in the UK, less than 1 out of 10 voted for the far right, and yet they won the EU elections. So there's two ways to read it here. Either you just simply read it the way that most of the media read it, which is it's a far right earthquake, Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage are the voice of the people, or you read it differently and say, well, you know, there's massive abstention and, you know, UKIP and the Front National have won, but they've won with less than 1 out of 10 voters. Two very different ways to read it. And of course, it was read the first way, as I said. And in the UK, this is what led to the referendum on the EU and then to eventually the UK leaving the EU. And you can see the agenda setting power here, because 1 out of 10 voters forced the hand of the then Prime Minister in the UK, David Cameron, to promise a referendum if he's re-elected in 2015. The referendum kicks in and the UK leaves the EU, even though in 2014, only one party in the UK had a platform that demanded that the UK would leave the EU, and it was supported by less than 1 out of 10 voters. So you can see how quickly things can evolve, even though they are not popular by any stretch of the imagination. So fast forward 10 years, in 2024, do we have a new earthquake or do we have the same old story? In the lead up to the election, what you could see, of course, was this front page from The Economist, which is platforming 3 women politicians, Giorgia Meloni, the leader of the far right in Italy, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far right in France, and von der Leyen, who was leading the EU, still is, and had been kind of like making quite a lot of noise in terms of mainstreaming far-right politics at the time. So what do we have in 2024? Well, a bit of both. It is a new earthquake, but it is also the same old story. The first point to make is that the roots behind the strong but uneven performance of the far-right across the board are the same as they were before. The issues that were feeding into far-right narratives haven't been tackled, and in fact, mainstreaming has gotten worse. Yet the scale of some of the successes are incredibly worrying. We've seen the rise of some far-right parties to record highs. And finally, this is particularly clear in the French case, but it does require a long-term understanding of the process of mainstreaming. So we cannot understand the process and the strength of the far right, the process of mainstreaming and the strength of the far right just by looking at one election. We need a longer view, and that's what I'm going to try to show you right now about France. So this is the progression of the Front/Rassemblement National in France, the far-right party. What you can see is 2 lines with the results that are written there as well. The 2 lines represent in darker the percentage of the vote, and in lighter the percentage of registered voters. So just as I did before, percentage of the vote is the people who vote, and the percentage is derived from that. In percentage of registered vote, it's all of the people who could have voted if we included them. What you can see already here is that, you know, there's a difference between the 2. And if you look at the lighter gray, there's far less of a progression than if you look at the darker gray. Why is that? It's because, well, you know, if you have a low turnout, it will make your percentage bigger automatically. And so you can see here that the Front National or the Rassemblement National does particularly well when there is a low turnout, if you look, for example, at 2017 or 2022. So let's do a bit of history of the Rassemblement National. The Rassemblement National is created in the early 1970s, and it is created as a fascist party, as a neo-fascist party, with groups of neo-fascists, groups of extreme-right people, and the first president of the Front National at the time is Jean-Marie Le Pen, who used to be pro-Pétain, and yet is seen as one of the most moderate people in the Front National at the time, which should tell you everything you need to know about the origins of the party. The first rise in the party is in the 1980s, when François Mitterrand, a socialist president, is elected in 1981. But very quickly, there will be a financial crisis. He will turn to austerity, and he will try to use the Front National at the time to split the right-wing vote. This will backfire, and this will lead to the first rise in the Front National as Jean-Marie Le Pen on the right is given more platforms. This also leads us to a long period that is very, very important. On the right, you have Jean-Marie Le Pen. On the left, you have Bruno Maigret, who played a very key part in the process of normalization of politics within the Front National at the time. Bruno Maigret is interested in right-wing Gramsciism, the idea that to gain political power, you first need to gain electoral power. And so what Bruno Maigret will do is to wage what he calls a war of vocabulary. What he says is we need to impose a vocabulary in the mainstream before we can gain power. And so it's talking about immigration, talking about Islam instead of talking about like obvious racism in a way. It's talking about kind of disguised forms of exclusion, disguised form of extreme right politics while keeping the same ideology. And this will work quite well, as you can see, and it will lead us to 2002, which is the first earthquake in French politics when Jean-Marie Le Pen gets to the second round of a presidential election. And again, this is something that is massively hyped and that has been completely misread in French politics. This is the first time I was allowed to vote in France myself. So, you know, it's something quite emotional for me as well. I was in the streets demonstrating against the rise of the Front National. And I was worried that fascism was at the door. And in fact, it was a complete misreading of the situation. Of course, it was extremely concerning that Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round. But it was a misreading because actually the problem was not Jean-Marie Le Pen, the problem was mainstream politics. If you look at Jean-Marie Le Pen's progression between 1988, 1995, and 2002, the main elections in France, the presidential elections, what you can see is that while he is rising a little bit, but not massively in terms of percents of the votes, he is very much stagnating when it comes to percentage of the registered votes. In fact, he's very much stagnating, 1147, 1142, and 1166. So how does he get to the second round? Well, he gets to the second round because turnout is very low for a presidential election, and because the mainstream parties are very much disliked and people turn away from them and instead vote for other alternatives. So 2002 is misread. Instead of reading it as a crisis of French democracy and a crisis in mainstream politics, what we read it as was as the rise of the far right, the Front National, and that will lead to speeding up its mainstreaming process. Most notably, it will lead to the mainstreaming and the man on the right here, which is Nicolas Sarkozy, who will promise in the 2007 election campaign that he will go and get Front National voters one by one, and he will manage to do quite well. And what you can see is that the Front National is falling back to 10% of the vote in the presidential election. On the night, Marine Le Pen, who is the director of campaign of Jean-Marie Le Pen, will be asked whether this is the end of the Front National, and she will say, I don't know if it's the end of the Front National, but in any case, this is the victory of our ideas. And I believe she probably was not far from the truth, because a couple of years later, she becomes the president of the Front National, which will then lead to a rise in the prospects of the party. What we can see is in 2012 already, her strategy of re-legitimization pays off. She's less threatening than her father. She has constructed an image that is much softer, and that pays off. She becomes third and breaks a new record. And you can see how she's third, and yet she has a better score than her dad had in 2002. Then we move on to 2017 and another record for the Front National, 21.3% of the vote, 16.14 when it comes to registered votes. So it's still around 15% of the vote. So it's not huge, but she is rising, which leads us then to 2022. And we get Marine Le Pen, of course, to the second round of the presidential election using so-called populism. You can see au nom du peuple, in the name of the people here. In the second round, Marine Le Pen is defeated, but she gets more than 33% of the vote. And this time, Emmanuel Macron is not managing quite as well to keep the Republican front together. And then that leads us, of course, to the legislative with a record in terms of députés. We also have Zemmour, we also have Marine Le Pen. the Assemblée Nationale, and we have various ideological victories, such as the law on immigration that is passed by Emmanuel Macron, that Marine Le Pen will claim as a victory for her party. And that leads us finally to 2024, when the Front National wins the EU elections, which leads to Macron to make an incredibly dangerous decision to call a snap election. And the Rassemblement National, which is led at this stage by Jordan Bardella, will win the first round of the legislative election, which is a shock. As you can see, 29.26% or 19.1% of the registered vote. There will be the creation of a national bloc against the Rassemblement National, which will work thanks to the left getting together. And no thanks to Macron, who played a terrible part in this. So what you can see really through the French case is that the mainstreaming process took a very long time, but not only did it take a very long time, it took the active involvement of mainstream actors, whether it's the media, hyping, exaggerating the power and the popularity of the far right. And also it took a lot of work from mainstream politicians to normalize the discourse of these parties, to make them the adversary to beat, to make them the alternative. And to demonize the left at the same time. So you can see that if you want to understand the mainstream process, you can't just look at the elections in 2024. You need to go way back to understand all of these processes and how they've been kind of like making everything kind of work in the favor of the far right. So let's look now at another side of the story. And I'm going to look at the UK because obviously you might have seen in the news that there has been racist riots in the UK. And if you would read the mainstream news in the UK, if you would listen to the government in the UK, it would seem that these riots come from nowhere, or that they come from social media, or that they come from even foreign forces like Russia, for example. What I want to argue is that actually, the racist riots in the UK were a long time coming, and that their main roots are to be found in mainstream discourse. And in the platforming of people like the guy you can see here, which is Nigel Farage, who has been mainstreaming far-right politics for a very long time with the help of mainstream politicians and media. So what I want to look at here is the issue of immigration and the way the issue of immigration has been constructed in a top-down manner, that is by the elite, by the mainstream political elite, by the mainstream media elite, but blamed on the people. And I will show you how by using some polling data. So first, in the UK, for many, many years, we have seen in mainstream public discourse that apparently immigration is one of the key concerns, if not the key concern of people in this country. It's not just the right-wing press that tells us that. It's also Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, who was saying this just over a year ago, or just under a year ago, when he launched his illegal migration crackdown to woo Tory voters. Rishi Sunak, of course, was saying something very similar, stop the votes. And the Home Secretary at the time under the Conservative Party was using some very far-right dog whistle, blaming the dogma of multiculturalism, for example. And so that leads us to this idea that, some people see images like this one, which is the racist riots that we saw in the last few days in the UK, as so-called legitimate concerns. We need to address the anger of these people because they represent a certain section of the population, even though, by any measurement, this section of the population is extremely small. And we saw it, in fact, yesterday when the far right was meant to cause more riots and to have more protests, and they were drowned out by counter-protesters who are far more numerous than the fascists, as always. So my question is, are we really concerned by immigration? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. But not in the way that we generally think. So if you look at various opinion polls, what you can see is that the concerns about immigration rise and fall depending on what is happening in politics and in the news. So for example, you will see it rising when we talk about enlarging Europe, because it's talked a lot about in the media and in politics. But then, interestingly enough, if you look at the Brexit vote on this image, you can see the concerns over immigration falling as soon as Brexit is voted, even though for many years, for 2 or 3 years after the Brexit vote, immigration did not fall and in fact continued to increase. So it's quite interesting how disconnected the concerns over immigration are with actually the levels of immigration. What happens, of course, is that the media, politicians talk far less about immigration at this stage. until recently at least. So one of the things that I did with my colleagues is to look at a particular opinion poll that is far more interesting than the other opinion polls who all ask the same questions about what are the biggest issues that you are facing at the moment. The opinion poll we looked at is the Eurobarometer. The Eurobarometer is very useful here because it asks two questions. And I stopped in 2018, not because I'm lazy, but I stopped in 2018 because that's also when the UK left the Eurobarometer, unfortunately. So I didn't have the data for it anymore. But the Eurobarometer used to ask two questions instead of just one. Actually, it used to ask three questions on this. What are the two biggest issues facing your country at the moment? What are the two biggest issues facing the EU at the moment? And what are the two biggest issues facing you personally at the moment? And then people were given 15 different solutions, 15 different answers. They could add others as well if they wanted to. And then we could see what the concerns were for people, for their country and personally. So this one, what you can see here is for our country or for the EU as a whole. And this is immigration. So immigration rarely comes first. It only comes first, in fact, once, which is in 2015 in the UK. You can see the peak there. But otherwise, it's second or third, but it's generally quite high. It's still, you can see that it never reaches 50%. And what you can see as well is that, interestingly, it peaks at the same time in France, the UK, and the EU, even though Brexit was, of course, only in the UK. So you can see that in the UK, logically, it peaks during the campaign on Brexit, or during the campaign for the referendum that will lead to Brexit. And it's no surprise, of course, but at the time, immigration was one of the issues that was most talked about in the media and generally negatively. But it also peaks in the EU and in France. And again, that's no surprise, because if you think of the context in 2015-16 in Europe, this is the time of the so-called refugee crisis. We also had a few terrorist attacks. Immigration is talked a lot about in our media by our politicians and so on. And so therefore, you can see a massive rise, and then you can see the rise fall as soon as the panic is over, even though immigration is still quite high. And so if you look at 10 years of polling in the UK, what you see is that immigration is the highest ranking issue. And you can also see that crime and terrorism are quite high as well, and they're generally related to far-right discourse. So, I'm not denying that in some opinion polls, immigration seems to be quite high. But now let's look at the other question that the Eurobarometer asks, which is, according to you personally, what are the two biggest issues you are facing at the moment? So the same people are asked a slightly different question, which is according to you personally, as opposed to your country. And this is what we get. This is the same scale, by the way. I'm not cheating on the scale. You can see it's 0 to 50 and 0 to 50. What you can see is people don't care anymore about immigration when they think about their day-to-day lives. If you look at it on a 10-year basis, you can see that immigration is way down towards the bottom. And interestingly, it's behind rising prices, health and social security, financial situation of your household, pensions, the economic situation in our country, unemployment, the education system, nothing, housing, crime, taxation, energy, the environment, and finally immigration. So what's going on here? Why do we have such a difference between the two when the same people are asked these two slightly different questions? Well, there's a lot of issues here that we need to think about. Some of them are that our knowledge beyond ourselves is mediated. It's always mediated. This is what Benedict Anderson talks about when he talks about imagined communities. We cannot know everything that takes place in our country, in our city, even in our university, right? We have to rely on sources of information, and these sources of information are many. It could be, it used to be, for example, religious institutions for a very long time, or it used to be trade unions, or it used to be friends, family, and the media, of course, and all the different forms of media, the traditional media, the social media, new media, influencers, and so on. So we have all these sources, but of course, some sources are more powerful than others. Some sources are more powerful to set the agenda, as Macrum's talked about. And these sources generally are the legitimate ones, which is the mainstream media that then ends up trickling into social media and so on, or mainstream politicians, the people who have power to speak over others. So even though many countries and many reactionaries like to talk about free speech, we know full well that free speech is pointless if we don't have equal speech, and we don't have equal speech. For example, at the moment, if Elon Musk says something completely ridiculous on Twitter, it will have a lot more power than if I say something that is not so ridiculous on Twitter. And so we need to keep all of this in mind. The information that we have to make decisions about our country and what matters for our country or the world is mediated by the information we receive. And that's where you can see the difference here taking place. When people think about their country, they're worried about immigration because that's what we are told to be worried. When people think about themselves, they're not worried about immigration because they know that it's not immigration that means that they might not be able to eat at the end of the week, that they might not be able to pay rent, that their children might not be able to go to school, that their parents will not have pensions, that their planet is heating up, that you have massive floods, for example, in Porto Alegre and so on and so forth. So, you can see that the things that affect you on a day-to-day basis is not immigration. The immigrant on a day-to-day basis is your neighbor, it's your pharmacist, it's your cleaner, it's whoever around you, but they have the same issue as yours. And this is why there's a massive disconnect between the way we build up society looking like this, which is immigration is a big concern and we need to listen to these people, or society is like this. And this is what happens when communities are threatened. We get counter protesters protecting communities. This is a photo from Bristol, near where I live, yesterday, where thousands of people went to protect shops, businesses, communities, lawyers against the threat of the far right. And not one far right person turned up. So that was a great victory. So what we need to think about is when we think about the mainstreaming of far right politics, we need to really question whether it is a bottom-up process, which is that's what the people want, and the media elite, the politician elite, they're just following what the people want. We're talking about immigration, we're talking about borders, we're talking about like criminality, we're using racism because that's what the people want, that's the way people are. But is it that simple? Is it that simple as the people say something that goes into opinion surveys and then that shapes whatever the media and politicians do? Well, of course not. Of course, it's not that simple. And in fact, what I would argue is that it's a circular process. And again, I'm building on our mainstreaming processes here. What you have is, the people has a tiny voice that is listened to by our generally opinion polls, but of course are skewed. Same with elections. You only have so many opportunities to vote. You only have so many parties you can vote for, so many platforms, so many ideas. And so that feeds into some kind of like voice of the people. But then, of course, these opinion polls are used by the media in a way or another. Various opinion polls can lead to various headlines. And then it's fed back into the people who then have to listen what the people what the voice of the people is as well, right? So it is a circular process rather than a simple top-down, bottom-up one. So to conclude, and I think I am on time. Where does that leave us? Well, we need to wonder what comes first, as I said. Are the rise and normalization of far-right politics far-right driven or are they mainstream driven? Is the rise of the far-right just a question of the far-right being popular, being clever, speaking to the people, or is it more complicated? Does the mainstream have a role to play in preventing the mainstreaming of far-right politics? And of course it does. We have seen many, many times that when the far-right is successful, it is backed up by mainstream actors, whether it is the mainstream media that will cover it too much consciously or not, whether it's using populism instead of racism, for example, to describe far-right actors, whether it is big money that tends to be behind the far right as well, and we're seeing it in the United States at the moment, with Trump being supported by a lot of very wealthy people, including Elon Musk, and so on. Is it people-driven or is it elite-driven? Again, here we need to be very critical of all the talks we hear about the white working class, for example, or the left behind. We need to remember that these politics are incredibly elitist, but they are led by elites as well. Nigel Farage in the UK, Donald Trump in the US, Elon Musk again. They are not working class people, they are elite people, and the politics that they are pushing are incredibly elitist as well. And finally, is it necessarily opposed to real existing liberalism? We need to be a lot more critical of the way really existing liberals are arguing that they are a bulwark against the far right, and therefore that we need to trust them, because what we have seen over the last years and decades is that quite often the self-avowed liberals are not necessarily the most resistant against the far right. So these are all difficult questions to answer, but they are key if we are to take the rise of the far right seriously. And I will end up here, but you have a bunch of stuff to read if you are interested to know more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Aurelien, for the very thought-provoking, very interesting conversation. And so I will wait a few minutes to see if anyone has a question. But since I'm here in this position, I would like to profit and to myself. And I would like to ask you about the role of the center, of the consensus at the center, if we can speak like that. And because we talk about this earthquake, this far right earthquake, and sometimes we are made to believe that it is impossible to overcome, that there is like this silent majority and the left behind, they are manipulated by the populists. And at least here in Brazil and Latin America, we see that the center sometimes makes us believe that we have to compromise with reactionary politics as the only alternative to stop this earthquake. And so they try to make us believe at the same time that there is no alternative and that they are the only alternative to reactionary politics and the rise of the far right. So I wanted to know what you think, and if you can talk a little bit more on this center, the political center aspect.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question, and this idea of no alternative, really echoes what I was talking about at the end about really existing liberalism in a way. What I've argued in my latest research is that we have in many countries and in many contexts, and of course, we have to be careful about different countries, different contexts have different kind of specificities, obviously. But in many countries, what we have been told is that we don't have a choice. The choice is either we stick with a liberal center and all of the problems it has to respond to the many crises we are facing, or we have the fascists, right? It's one or the other, But at the same time, we're also told that we need to incorporate, as you said, the fascists and what they want, or the far right, or whatever we want to call them. I call them more fascist now, having seen what happened in the UK recently, because there's really no other words to call it. But and so we are told that we need to include them as well. So we have these two alternatives. None of them are satisfying. None of them are popular by any stretch of the imagination. If we look at polling data, if we look at electoral data, all of these kind of things, neither of them are popular. But we are limited to that, we are told, because what the people want is crack down on immigration. They want some racist politics, all of these kind of things. But again, there are alternatives. We know them full well. And if I'm going to share my screen again. In this slide, what I show is very much where the alternative lies. If you look at the concerns of people this way, what you see is these concerns. The far right has no answer to them, and liberalism has no answer to them either, or the liberal elite at least has no answer to them. Really, what I call in my work, really existing liberalism, which is not like the ideal of liberalism, which doesn't exist, but the way liberalism is put in practice, or has been put in practice so far, has no answer to rising prices and cost of living. We've seen no answer to that, even though all of our societies have been hit by that recently. Health and social security, this has gotten worse and worse in the societies that had good health and social security, which were very few, of course. And it's not getting better. Financial situation of your household, again, getting worse. In a lot of places, pensions for those who are lucky to even have some, they know they're not going to get them for much longer. Economic situation in the country, it's not even working by capitalistic standards. Unemployment, again, maybe unemployment might be low in some countries, but precarity is massive. Education system, again, getting worse. So, whether it is, and the far right, of course, has no answers to any of that, right? And the liberal center has no answers to that. And the alternative is there. There's the demand for change. But that demand for change would be radical change. And this would come at a cost to the people who are leading us at the moment. And that's why they'd rather have to face the far right, which is still scary in a way, and which still force people to vote for them, than face a left-wing progressive alternative that would actually provide answers to these questions, which are people's core questions. how am I going to pay rent? How am I going to have a better life? All of these kind of things. I don't know if I answered your question, but I might have gone on a tangent.
Yes, sure. It was perfect. Thank you very much. And I can see on YouTube that we have some interactions. I wouldn't say questions because I think I think the subject of our talk is reaching the chat, and they are asking about the normalization of the far left. And
okay.
I have
I'd love to see it. I'd love to see the normalization of the far left. I mean, I don't know what kind of fantasy world you live in, but this is not reality, right? You just need to wake up, I think. And if you really think that there's a normalization of the far left, I think you have been going down a massive rabbit hole, and I feel sorry for you that you're being so easily manipulated by bad faith actors. Look, I'm sorry that you're falling for these really stupid phantasmagoric narratives. But if that makes you happy, right? I don't think it does make you happy as well, to be fair. So sorry.
Yeah, because if I may, it makes me think that it always comes. Not always, but sometimes and quite often it comes with some resentment, and it can really bitter you up, I don't know. So
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe they can try to learn something from your presentation, because it was really thought-provoking and really interesting. And well, I don't know if I have any more questions here. So perhaps, I don't know if you want to make a final remark or anything, and I think we can finish our conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it was a pleasure to chat. It was a pleasure to chat, and share my research. And for whoever is listening on YouTube, honestly, of course, if you feel that if you think that fighting the system at the moment and being brave and being radical is siding with the elite, go for your life, right? Clearly it's not making you happy, but because as Gabrielle said, you're incredibly resentful and bitter, but you're also not being brave. You're fighting on the side of power, so assume it. And if you really want to fight against power and against the elite, then I think you need to kind of read more about progressive politics, because that's where the right struggle is. And it's obvious, and justify it however you want. This is not the far right that's defending the people.
Okay, so actually we have. Can you hear me? I think my connection just. Okay. We have a question by Alfredo, our co-owner of our research group, and he's not able to join us at the room, but he sent me a question here in the chat. And he says, congratulations on the presentation. It was very interesting. And I would like to comment on the aspect of far-right politics that is quite intriguing. I am referring to the common points found in far-right agendas across different countries. Unlike left-wing governments, which tend to be quite different, the agendas of far-right groups seem to have more similarities and differences in various countries. For example, if we analyze Bolsonaro and Milei in Argentina, their agendas are very similar, or at least that's the impression that Professor Alfredo has. So if we can comment something like this.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting question. I think there are peculiarities as well, but I think there are similarities. I mean, far-right politics are based on exclusion. They're generally based on targeting minorities, on scapegoating minorities, so as to divert attention and anger away from the sources of power and from the sources of what makes people unhappy. So these are kind of traditional things that you will always see on the far right. Racism as well, of course, the hatred of various other minorities and so on. Where it can differ at time is in the economic program that we put forward, and I think that Bolsonaro and Milei here were very similar in terms of their kind of more neoliberal outlook, and I think probably Milei pushing it even further than Bolsonaro did. This is something that we used to see in Europe until the turn of the century. So in the 1980s, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen loved Ronald Reagan, compared himself to Ronald Reagan in France. But this changed eventually because the far right tried to appeal to the disillusioned working class. It didn't necessarily work, but it was lapped up by a lot of the elite in the media in particular. And, we saw it, for example, in 2016 in the UK, where Brexit was blamed on the working class, but also in the United States, where, the election of Donald Trump was blamed on the white working class, even though if you look at electoral data, it's not the working class that voted for Trump, it's wealthy people. And of course they did, because, they got tax cuts and so on, and it's predominantly white people, because we also got the racism on top of it. So they were quite happy with it. So yeah, we have to be careful with these narratives. So I think the similarities, I think, on the far right are it's because their politics are so simplistic in a way. Their politics are just blame minorities who have no power and pretend that they are the ones who have power, while we keep power for ourselves. Left-wing politics are much more complicated, obviously, because they are actually trying to address the real issues of the people, and that's why it creates quite a lot of kind of struggle to kind of find easy platforms and sometimes easy messaging as well.
Thank you very much. And I think we don't have any more questions, so I would just like to thank you once again for your time and for your availability. And I'm sure that everyone is like with their heads popping with ideas, because it's really, unfortunately, we do not always have access to such a critical approach to the phenomena of the rise of the far right, and especially in such different contexts in Europe and Latin America. So thank you very much once again. And I think I will just finish our transmission here on YouTube. And I think, once again, and I will just finish now in Portuguese, ok?
Ok.
Então, gente, muito obrigada pela presença, pela audiência. E como eu estava falando para o professor aqui, eu tenho certeza que essa foi uma apresentação que fez pipocar muitas ideias na nossa mente, porque não é sempre que a gente tem acesso a uma perspectiva tão crítica e tão, de certa forma, inovadora, quando a gente vai pensar sobre o avanço da extrema-direita, tanto na América Latina quanto na